So my name is Isha Mishra, and I'm on the Regrow team. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're really glad to have you here, and it's such a great way to end the week and to kick off 2024. So 2024 stands as a pivotal moment for agriculture, a year in which we expect to see exponential progress in our collective pursuit of agriculture resilience. So today we are thrilled to have a discussion of 2023 learnings and predictions for 2024. And to have that discussion, we have two innovative leaders here to share their perspective. But before we dive in, I have a few quick tips and notes. So a few things to note. You are able to turn on closed captioning on your Zoom screen. So if you go down to the bottom bar, there should be an option. So if you should require that, feel free to do that. We will be sending out this recording of the event to all those who registered, and it will be available on the site. And the last 15 minutes will be a live Q&A. So make sure to submit your questions through the Q&A box, but not the chat, just the Q&A box. We'll be able to see that. And we will consolidate the questions and spend around at the 35-minute mark, we'll dive into live Q&A. Awesome. So thank you so much for being here. And if you do feel free, if you've had a chance to join, you can go ahead and in the Q&A, throw in a couple questions that you already have, just so we can make sure the audience is engaged, ready to go. We'd love to see your questions coming in throughout. So thank you all for being here. Awesome. So before we officially kick off, I'll start with a quick round of introductions. So today we have Shalini Unnikrishnan, who's a managing director and partner with Boston Consulting Group and the global lead for climate sustainability and societal impact for consumer practice and the global lead for sustainable food and nature solutions. Her work at BCG focuses on the intersection of agriculture and food systems transformation, circularity and waste, as well as equity and inclusion. And then we also have Dr. Anastasia Volkova, who's a CEO and co-founder of Regrow. She is a recognized thought leader and innovator in regenerative agriculture and sustainable food sourcing, and she has more than 10 years of experience in academia, business, and startups. She's earned her PhD in aerospace engineering, and she was recently named one of Time 100's list of the 100 most influential people in the world, and a 2023 UBS Global Visionary and a Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst. So thank you both so much for being here. And to kick it off, I'll pass the mic to Anastasia, and I'll be back in about 30 minutes for live Q&A. So be sure to put your questions in.
Thanks so much, Isha. And Shalini, so great to have you here. So great to have this chat in such a structured way. Both of us probably could catch each other at COP and try to do a 5 seconds exchange on this. It's so great to have half an hour of a discussion, and also do it post probably the end of year reflections and the new year kickoff. So I'm excited for today's discussion.
Yeah, me too.
Let's kick off with unexpected questions. Regrow loves those, I believe. 2023 surprise. What surprised you? What was the prediction that you got wrong? You spend a ton of time thinking about this space, just like my team and myself included. What was something that you reflected on at the end of the year and thought, wow, that was different from how I thought it would be?
Yeah. It's a question that I have to think about for a second in some ways, because there's so many to pick from. I'm not very good at predicting things, apparently. But since you mentioned COP, let me maybe go there. I think what was pleasantly really surprising for me was what happened with the food and agriculture agenda at COP. We knew it was going to be a big deal, right? First time we're getting a whole day, first time, it's really on the table, if you will, and there's a discussion. BCG is a strategic partner of the COP presidency, was this year, was the year before, and the year before. And so we were along on the journey. And, when the initial the declaration was brought together of the countries, was like hundreds. The first 80 are easy, but getting to 100 countries is hard. And then the numbers just skyrocketed. I mean, there's not probably too many things that China and the US signed, right? Like these days. So I think we've reached 160 now countries, and that's pretty big. The non-state actors work, so the coalitions, including the one we were engaged in on landscapes, just the momentum, the energy. And I went to the COP. Every time I go to COP, I do, lots of things, and I'm busy. I did just food and agriculture and nature for 14 straight days from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. And I was still busy. There was just so much energy in that agenda. And I did not predict that. I knew it was a moment, but I didn't realize that there was so much pent up energy in this community to kind of come together. So it was amazing.
I absolutely agree with you on that one. It almost outperformed our expectation, which probably was conservatively set given the previous COPs in terms of the alignment, both of non-state actors and the private sector actors, and seeing the cross-industry collaboration to end the year as a note on a number of First Movers Coalition, the regenerative landscapes being announced and put together, the commitments accelerated by some of the leading brands in the industry. That was positive to me. I definitely was surprised at the COP outcome too. I must say that I was also a little bit surprised to not see faster acceleration of the on-the-ground adoption of practices, because we've reported, I think early in the year, that looking back 7 years, the adoption was 250% growth, but it's extremely small percentages. So whilst we are more than doubling, we're still in single-digit percentages of adoption of practices like cover cropping and tillage across very large swath of landscapes. And having had in mind that the climate smart and the European Green Deal cap policy were already in place at the end of 2022, I was hoping to see more momentum, and we were kind of pinned up in a little bit more bureaucracy there by the feeling of it. So that was a little bit surprising to me.
Does that concern you looking forward, or do you feel optimism?
Great question. So on one hand, I feel a great deal of optimism that trajectory overall is a positive trajectory. I see this acceleration towards the end of 2023 as a very positive note. We definitely feel it in terms of being pulled into more discussions, the discussions being framed. We can't do more pilots. We need to scale. This is coming out from leading sustainability executives in the industry. Yet, because we both support the public and private sector actors as well as work very closely with farmers, not seeing as much transformation take place in the ground yet, is a little bit of a concern. I'm hoping that it's in a little bit of an incubation phase where it needs to ramp up, but my mind goes to 2030 and taking the construction of every year to 2030 and knowing that it takes 3 years to figure out any program in agriculture for a completely new program and completely new actor. And so working backwards, we need to start now.
Exactly. I mean, I do think, I got optimism. I agree with you. Time's running out. I don't know, maybe it's already run out, but time's running out. We don't have too many growing cycles left to 2030. Agriculture takes time. And I think the urgency is absolutely clear. There's not enough money flowing into the space. Even within climate finance, we've got about 3% of money flowing into the space. But what gives me a little bit of optimism is, as we set up the initiative we're involved in, the first thing that we heard from pretty much every player, private sector and other non-state actors, was, we don't want to make new commitments. We're done. We don't want to join new coalitions just for the sake of marketing. Unless you are coming to us with a way to drive scale, that's the only reason we'd be interested, right? And that's a little bit different than a few years ago, where everyone was willing to sign up to whatever commitment and whatever thing it was so that they could, get the little bit of PR. I don't know that people have solved it yet, but at least there's clarity that this is, scale is where people need to focus.
And Shalini, how do you see the unlocks to build the scale off of this momentum? Because I think we see a lot of momentum. It seems to start having teeth in it. We still have a lot of questions as to who will reinforce the adherence and monitoring of the traction towards achieving the target. people understand that they can't do it themselves. The system is very, very large. The supply chain, value chain is very complex.
Yeah.
What do you see in an in-between layer? On one hand, we have COP and Davos, and that's where the big things get said and announced. And on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, we have people day-to-day working with their suppliers and farmers. And where do you see the necessary unlocks to convert this momentum into traction and scale?
Yeah. So maybe I'll take an example. So I've referred to this a couple of times, right? So we put together this action agenda on regenerative landscapes at COP28. It has brought together 26 organizations at COP, and now at least a dozen more are starting to come in, so that number is kind of growing. But it has players from the PepsiCo, Nestle, Danone, Unilever, those for CPGs, many of them, but also the traders, Archer Daniel Midland, Bunge, Cargill, Louis Dreyfus, distributors, fertilizer players, banks, but also other non-state actors like the Nature Conservancy and others who are involved in large-scale programs, World Farmers Organization, and so on. So it's quite the coalition. It's very focused on implementation. And there are three fundamental principles that we're trying to activate through this, right? One is that we need place-based action for scale. I think we think that there's going to be some magic solution to scale that we're going to roll out globally. Agriculture is incredibly local. Every crop is a different story. Every kind of context is different. There's smallholder farmers, there are large-scale farmers, there's farmers that lease their land, farmers that own their land. There's just so many variables that trying to come up with one solution. So we need place-based solutions. That's one theory where we believe strongly in. The other is it has to be farmer-centric. And by that, it doesn't mean that we just say farmers are great and that makes the program farmer-centric. It has to make economic sense for the farmers. We can't expect them to do all this extra work or do different work, take on all the risk, and then not compensate them for it, right? It is so we've got to work the math and work the economics in a way that the benefit of this has to accrue back to the farmers. It's not to say that others in the value chain can't get some benefit out of it. They can, but the balance is just not very right at the moment. So there's that, which is how do you design for that place the right economic model so that it makes sense for farmers to take on the risk and the work. I think the third part, which is different but is very hard, is to take a real systems-based lens and to create joint action. So I use this very silly analogy. I've used it over and over again in Davos and COP and everywhere. So, someone's going to make me stop. But the analogy that I use is if it takes 10 people to move a rock, 10 of us can't take turns to move it. We kind of got to do it together. And I think what's happened is that every project and pilot is like, the fertilizer player does something with someone, and then someone else does something with someone else in the next farm over. Everybody's got tons of programs in the same space, but they're not talking to each other. And, we did this study in the Midwest of the US, and farmers are getting like 4 or 5 touch points a week. They're just sick and tired of hearing from everybody on how to run their lives, right? So they're not listening, and everyone's giving them a piece of the information in contradicting ways. So the third part of our theory of change to drive scale is really about bringing the curated right group of players in a landscape and figuring out what the joint action plan is and that they deliver in a joint way. Across the off-taker, the trader and the processor, the input player that's engaging, but also the banks and the financing players. Organizations show up and say, I have a loan. Great, but the farmer doesn't just need a loan. Farmer needs insurance. Farmer may need a grant for certain things. How do you build that whole stack? So anyway, I think those three things, we got to disaggregate and make it place-based. We've got to help the farmer make money. And we've got to stop thinking that every one of us is going to lead the way. We need joint action plans in every one of these landscapes. That's my theory at the moment. I'm sure I'm missing some things, but anyway, that's sort of where we're starting, at least.
No, of course, Shalini. I think the analogy of the rock and taking turns and trying to move it is a great one, and perfectly captures that the 10 people across the supply chain touched a rock, but would never seem to coordinate or never seem to have that coordination to come at the same time and actually move it together to put the resources, time it, specify it, and make a difference.
Yeah.
What you're sharing also ties perfectly into the conundrum of currently, from the regulatory perspective, there's more incentive to actually disaggregate these claims, and this is where we effectively are disincentivizing the behavior that looks at landscapes as a whole. With some of, especially our leading partners, we are having these conversations where certain regulatory policies that we need to live by as an agriculture food fiber industry effectively request us to prove causality. So if a company makes a change, makes a difference, they effectively need to know which part of that, the outcome of that change, can they associate their investment in, was almost as a return on investment. And whilst generally speaking, there's nothing wrong with it, it may lead, given the rotation of crops in the landscape, the shifts of the volumes of various crops due to climatic conditions in the landscape, make it all so much more difficult. And I specifically love that you focused the agenda on the landscapes. It wasn't just regenerative food system, regenerative agriculture, or resilient food system agenda. It was truly about regenerative landscapes. Maybe you can touch on this a little bit in terms of how you're thinking of the approach to landscape being the alignment that everyone needs to truly move that rock forward versus where regulatory is. And I'm certainly very interested to share with the listeners today what other regulatory things we're observing, because I think when we speak about hurdles and alignment, that piece does come up. As if there's a will, there's a way. It seems like the will is there. Is there a way?
Yeah, and I'd love to hear from you as well. I'll give you a quick my quick take, but I'd love to hear from you as well after that on this regulatory landscape, because you see so much of what's evolving and so on, and you're close to many of these conversations. I think none of this is going to move without the policy context. Private sector alone, non-state actors alone are not going to be able to move it and drive the transformation and in the agricultural system without regulation, without the policy environment changing, whether that's through regulation or other means, but the policy context changing. So we're really hoping we can partner with policymakers. And the landscape part of it was in some ways because it makes sense at multiple levels, right? It makes sense because it's at scale enough that multiple companies, it makes sense for them to act on, right? If you have a few farmers here and a few farmers there and so on, getting all the group together, so the return on investment on time is not there, right? So you want it to be at scale enough that people can make meaningful difference. But landscape also has a nature connection, which is really important, right? So a landscape is not just about a collection of farms. It's also the water and the biodiversity and the forest and anything else that is the natural assets in that area. And that's really important, A, to make sure that we are bringing nature outcomes to happen, but B, it also brings in a whole bunch of new actors. I know of one program, for instance, where it was the water utility that was willing to pay the farmers for regenerative practices because it was reducing their costs of cleaning and filtering the water from all the nitrogen runoffs. So it expands the pot, it gets to nature outcomes. For all those reasons, it's interesting. But from a policy regulatory point of view, I think it's also interesting because it's at scale enough that we can bring a governor, a senator, or a meaningful part. Like it feels big enough as an area that you could get policymakers' attention and almost create regulatory sandboxes, if you will, for that, for these landscapes to define the transition. But I'm curious, because there's so much going on in the space that's beyond this, right? There's CSRD, there's Farm Bill, there's California regulations, etc. How are you thinking about what's evolving? What are you thinking about this landscape?
Yes, one of the surprises for me from 2023, I remember very acutely that we were waiting for SEC draft disclosure rules to go in.
Yeah.
And almost instead, what we got is California responding with a similar regulation requesting companies above $1 billion, $5 billion of trade in California to disclose their scope 1, 2, 3, which is very important. And we see, at least in the US, and I'll touch on Europe and other regions in a second, as you mentioned, CSRD. But as we're looking to the US, usually that path of having California adopt a law and then New York or Washington adopt a law seems to be a path of not only economic innovation that policy enables, but also the normalization of that policy within the American political landscape that is frankly quite necessary. If you're introducing a policy such as this in Sacramento, of course, you need to work out how to actually administer it, how to put the guardrails around it, and put in a little bit of that push, with what it feels like enough time to deliver on it, is a nice forcing function. And CSRD is a similar one. So when we're thinking about the European regulation and how much export in food and ag and fiber industry is going to Europe, which is now looking specifically as what's coming in through the ports, and demanding not only from the domicile companies, but also from those that are importing its goods to Europe to adhere to certain sustainability and climate regulations, to be clear on its scope 1, 2, 3 goals, how they're set, how they're monitored, how they're tracked, what the plans are. Also was very interesting. You mentioned banks, because it's such an important part of the group of the 10 people around the rock. It seems like the first, we have the middle three, but not the first three and not the last four often, which is a very funny situation we're in. And so in the UK, having more and more banking institutions really being enforced to report on the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. For anyone who hasn't seen it, that was an early initiative led by Mike Bloomberg that ultimately led to fairly straightforward 2-page digestible plans for industries. It's really worth looking. If there's any piece of legislation that I was able to digest over, a morning tea, it was that one. And I was very impressed, and it laid the foundation really to say, you need to know what happened, you need to know what could happen, and you need to tell everyone what you're going to do about it. And that just seemed like such a straightforward framework. So I'm excited about the fact that not only they're being announced, these frameworks, but also we're really seeing some demands from the legislative system to implement them within private business. And of course, there is the big, very open-ended question called Farm Bill. So I'm not sure whenever that happens is a bit of a question, right? Because the more time it takes, the less time we have to do what it enables us to do. And I would definitely like to touch on this just briefly, that whenever I guess you and I interact with a lot of those brand companies across the value chain, we're definitely hearing, and I would imagine you would agree, that regulatory piece on reporting is one of them, but the other one is if we're putting some incredible amount of subsidies globally permitted into agriculture, and I forget exactly what the number is, but it was a staggering number.
It's 800,
exactly,
more than 800 billion.
800 billion into ag, and most of them are not building a more resilient agriculture system, in which we've already observed the supply chain breakages, leakages, fractures that we need to not only mend in the Band-Aid fashion, but truly create a more sustainable path for
Yeah.
the goods to flow one way and for the value to flow the other way. That seems like a very obvious place to get 800 billion out of a few trillion that we need to truly revolutionize the industry globally. And revolutionize might sound like a buzzy word, but truly we need to take a slightly different path and incentivize different things and build different systems of value exchange.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many counter incentives built in today into those subsidies. They are, they make it easier to get access to fertilizers, which sounds good, but at the same time, that's preventing people from shifting practices. They prevent farmers who are doing regenerative practices from actually being insured because apparently it was their choice to do something because of which their yield dropped versus an extreme climate event. But the whole reason they're doing it is so that they're more resilient. But anyway, so our insurance system doesn't work for that. There are parts of the world that shouldn't be growing certain things, but the governments will continue to incentivize with floor prices and so on, farmers to keep growing something that shouldn't be grown in that soil in that place. And so it just keeps stacking up. There's examples everywhere in the world of the subsidies in the agricultural system, not just not being aligned to climate incentives, but also not being aligned to our food security, our hunger, our nutrition incentives either. There's just so many innovative grains, traditional grains that we should be advancing around the world that can be nutritious, that can be more resilient, but the incentive construct just doesn't exist for them to be grown at a meaningful scale and for the markets to develop. So just a lot we could be doing differently than that 800 something billion dollars for sure.
Yes, and you spoke about the innovation that Chile is reintegrating indigenous practices and looking as to how the world was managed when we didn't have these subsidizing skewing motions, which are necessary for us to function, but also are so difficult to keep in line with the needs of the marketplace, with the needs of the planet for its health and its boundaries, including the people. That is one of, I guess it could be definitely one of the breakthroughs that we will see, either policy-wise or supply chain-wise. But what are some of the other breakthroughs, maybe on the side of science, and what have you seen that moves resilience in agriculture system forward? What are some of the solutions that, if scaled, they could really make a big impact?
Yeah. What's interesting about agriculture is that there are, I get jazzed about the low-tech solutions, and maybe we don't call them innovative, but there are some really good ideas that if we could scale them, that are relatively easy things. Because there's of course very cool things. When I was at COP, I got to meet a bunch of startups that have very cool new tech, right? That's going to reduce the emissions from a cow and do lots of interesting things and grow proteins in cool ways. And I think that's all great. But the stuff that gets me jazzed is things like biochar, right? We got plenty of data. There are companies now that are able to do it at lower and lower costs. The innovation there is not just about the tech, because the tech is taking waste from agricultural waste. In fact, I didn't know this until earlier today that you could actually take the waste even from an ethanol plant and still use it. And so you could take waste, create energy, create biochar that is permanent removal of carbon and substantially helps yield. And it's a one-time application, so it's not like you're doing it again and again. And get some real carbon value and some real, some impact on yield and on resilience. I think it's really exciting space. There's CapEx, but it's not that huge of a CapEx investment. It needs some smart companies that can build out a really good operating model so that you can measure and track and do all those things well, and set these things up well, you know, lower the operating costs and so on. But it's here. It's you know, there's enough data that, you know, we need to scale. Similarly, as I just mentioned, you know, millets and grains, there's so many interesting crops that we really could be accelerating. I got a chance to meet. We collaborate with chef Pierre Thiem, who's, you know, does a lot of work in Fornio, for instance. I was so inspired to meet him, right? Like, just incredible opportunity to take something that is indigenous, that can grow well in the conditions that, you know, this part of West Africa has, can really create livelihoods for smallholder farmers, incredibly nutritious. So, I mean, just fantastic, right? But we need to be innovative in how we design food around it. Like, we think any kind of food that's millets and grains just has to taste horrible because it must taste healthy and therefore must be bland. But how do you create really interesting food out of all of that? So that's the kind of innovation that I get excited about. It's already here. And it's really about bringing the pieces together in that space.
Yeah, certainly.
What about you?
I get excited about.
Get you excited? Yeah.
Yeah, I get excited about impact. I get excited to see things change on the ground. I get excited that we have that unprecedented level of visibility. When I look at CDP disclosures, here's the nerd, right? When I look at CDP disclosures of companies as to how they set their Scope 3 targets, how many of them did set their Scope 3 targets, how aggressive or how realistic towards the right trajectory, how aligned with the right trajectory are those targets, we went from a world in which we didn't quite know what Scope 3 emissions were to a world where we do know with 80-90% accuracy. And that to me is unprecedented lever. What you can measure, you can manage. Of course, I am excited about a lot of solutions that you mentioned, but also about this specifically, because if we look at the agriculture value chain, 70 to 90% of emissions of any company doing its business is Scope 3. A lot of it is on the farm. So 70% of all emissions would end up just occurring on the farm level. So if we don't know what we're trying to solve for and what the appropriate place-based solution is, it is very romantic to think about we can tackle it. But we've gone in the last couple of years, even ourselves, for monitoring, tripling our monitoring capacity. And now we're at 1.3 billion acres. That's more than 10% of arable land on which we can truly see the change. It excites me that I can sit here or stand next to you in a big hall of peers and say, no, you can literally not tell me you don't know anymore. We have an ability to know, and we have an ability to scale. And as one of the questions that's come up in the chat, in the Q&A, as to what is one of the biggest obstacles. And from my perspective, the obstacles were spending inordinate amount of money on capturing the data on a per acre level in very small pilots, and now being able to rely on the scaling technologies like remote sensing, like modeling, that are getting approval, that are getting regulatory acceptance, that are being put in sustainability reports that generate real impact. And you suddenly go from 5 acres, 50,000 acres that are really, really hard to finance for those players because they're hundreds and hundreds of dollars on an acre, because it's being approached almost as a research project and not as a next supply chain solution that inevitably has to be put in place. So the cost of making an intervention and the cost of monitoring, reporting, and verifying that intervention, MRVing it, was so high, limiting the MRV cost and lowering by bringing more players, by aligning the subsidies, lowering the barrier to adoption, both financially and technically, to get to that scale, is what I would say excites me the most, because I went to see the impact not just within my lifetime, but in the next 7 years, I want to see the map go from red to green. I want to and see the swings in yield losses in climatically critical years go from staggering 19 billion in just crop insurance to a buffered system that got back into the planetary boundaries that can truly at scale be visible to the world, be not ashamed of anything because it does the right thing by the humans and the planet. And I really see the path. The science shows us that there's a path there. So that it just feels very exciting to me.
Yeah, that's inspiring to hear, and I'm very aligned. I do think what you hit upon, this whole need for data, for transparency, and for a cheap, high quality MRV system is critical, not just to lower the cost of implementation, but without it, you cannot have private capital flow in. Right? If capital can't measure, they don't know how to validate, and they don't know how to, figure out the returns, they're not coming. And there's the reason why
the business case, it doesn't exist, right?
It's
the
not
business
there.
case.
There's no way for them to actually run the math to say this is the asset I'm investing in, and here's how it's going to drive returns. So, there's a reason why there's, small, tiny 3-4% of climate finance going into agriculture. And it's a big part due to this fragmentation. And, I want to touch on that question as well of obstacles and roadblocks. I think part of it is this transparency in data, but part of it is also related to it is organizations sharing that data across from each other in a pre-competitive way, but starting to share their experiences. Not everybody has to reinvent the pilots. What data do you have on what's working and what's not working? What data do you have on farmer, financials and profitability, and what you need to motivate them to action? What data do you have on who's working where? Like, that's one thing we're trying to aggregate. So in the action agenda, for instance, every company is telling us where they are doing regen ag projects and where they plan to do them for the next several years, with which partners, with what money, etc. Now that's confidential, but we try to aggregate that behind the scenes so that companies can start to be match made with each other, and we can start to get a little more transparency in the world of what's happening. So I think this whole stream of data, MRV, and even best data on what you're doing operationally is really critical. And the more we can create transparency across partners, the more likely we'll be able to move faster.
Exactly. I can't agree with you more. And we definitely see the leaders in the space definitely not buying into this false narrative that scope 3 is too hard, collaboration is impossible. They're truly taking the torch and leading in that space. And it's just fantastic to see the impact on those programs scale. I feel compelled to call out that, for example, when General Mills came out and said, here is what the data looks like when you monitor your supply sheds. This is what we could do together. Come join. You can get access to such information yourself. Look at what's possible. When we see programs such as what Cargill runs in Regen Connect, going upstream and downstream and saying, let's partner to get to farmers, let's partner to take this to market and address the consumer needs. It's just incredible to see the scale they're able to achieve by truly treating this as a non-negotiable and as if the future is here now, not waiting. That to me are just the hallmarks that open collaboration that Marth has put out. Like, here's our playbook. Please go and look at our playbook. See what, Shalini, exactly as you were saying, see what we decided about this, because all of those players work with the same players. It's not a supply chain that's completely isolated. It's supply web.
It's pretty concentrated.
So it's pretty concentrated.
Yeah.
So the same requests flow upstream to the same people.
Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned consumer, and that's one of the questions that's popped up, which is, what role do you expect evolving consumer expectations to play in driving sustainability and climate investments? I have a bit of a view, but tell me, what are your thoughts? on how consumer expectations are likely to change or evolve?
No, I'll let you jump in first, and then I'll give
Okay,
you some
all right.
examples from our life.
Oh, sounds good. Look, I'll start off with a sobering fact, right? So we've done research similar to many others that shows the end consumer, right? You and I, and as we walk into grocery stores and we walk into restaurants, a large percentage of us say that we care. A very, very, very small percentage, single digits, are willing to actually pay. So that say-do gap exists. We are creatures of habit. We have many, many things we're optimizing on, whether it's, especially cost of living goes up. It's not easy for people to just optimize on more expensive food, or choices around that. It's not easy for people to optimize on healthy when something interesting and exciting is in front of them. And it's not easy for people to navigate the information and the complexity of all this. Is it been produced well or not? Like I'm standing in the grocery store with a screaming toddler. Like, do I really want to scan a QR code on a ketchup bottle to figure out if it's made better or not made better? Right? I don't have the time. I'm grabbing ketchup and I go. So for many, many reasons, there is a huge consumer gap. But there's two positive pieces of information in the surveys that we've been doing, in the analysis we've been doing on consumer expectation. One, that it is trending in a direction that is, even if it's slowly, but it's trending in a direction that more and more people are aware. And it is not just a European phenomenon. It is in North America, it is in Asia, it is everywhere. And so more and more people are aware and starting to bring that into the consideration set. The other is that when sustainably sourced ingredients, food, etc., can actually help a consumer with making a choice that fits with their other needs, you suddenly get to 40, 50, 60% of the consumer. So my point being, we use the silly example of Tesla, right? Like nobody was buying a Tesla because they thought it was green. Well, not nobody. Most people were not buying it because they thought it was green. They bought it because it was seemed like a cool car and seemed like it was fun to drive. And, it was techy, it was whatever.
And the gas was very expensive. The number of Lyft and Uber drivers.
Right? So,
yeah.
So there's different reasons. In the same way, like as people make decisions on food, etc., our research shows that if we can link the narrative to quality, to better for my family, to in some parts of the world safer, right? Because there's in certain parts of Asia there's concerns about food safety, and many other such attributes. If the narrative is made simpler, the narrative is made clearer to what people care about, versus it being something big and this thing about carbon and tons of whatever in the ground, it does change behavior. So my answer to the consumer expectations is that it is an evolving thing. We're not all there yet, but it can be moved in the right direction with the right narrative and the right focus.
Yeah, I would agree and add to what you're sharing in terms of your perspective on the consumer behavior is that whilst not the primary driver compared to truly the financial disruption that the climate disruption is causing, the consumer behavior is definitely, as the generational preferences shift, is shifting towards more sustainable products. There's definitely statistics on the consumer goods side of market that show that the sustainably marketed opposition products grow double digit compared to single digit in even ordinary categories, so to speak. I would love to give an example here because you talked about the mom with the screaming child in the cart, and I remember working with the fabulous team at Killanova back then, Kellogg, and working on our ingrained project with them, and really thinking about on the box communication, how, when you're doing something that is better for the farmer, better for the environment, this rice is ultimately better for everyone involved, including the consumer. What is the shortest, clearest way to reach out to that consumer and say, we are doing the right thing for you, our loyal consumer, and this is what this thing is. We don't want to inundate you because, yes, it's the children are probably screaming and you really want to get out of the supermarket. But I believe seeing more and more some of the just the iconic brands, not only the new coming brands, but iconic brands come into this realm. For example, Super Bowl with Brian Ham of Unilever
Yeah.
on the food waste, which is also a big contribution. There's a reason why they've been pounding that pavement for a while, and it's aligned with the product, but equally that product is now being aligned with regenerative agriculture investments, and that's great to see. And I think that clarity of consumer communication will only align all of the aspects of the agriculture and food supply chain with the right outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I do agree with you that this is shifting. This is definitely shifting over time. And there's opportunity for so much innovation, so much creativity, all the way from the front end of products and new products to how it's marketed, how it's positioned. That entire business model can be innovated upon.
Yes. Well, Isha, please come back to us. Moderate us
Yeah, we
for the
see a few more
Q&A.
questions.
Perfect timing, as we've had quite a few questions come in, so I figured it would be a great time to go into the live Q&A. And thank you both so much for being here. It's so awesome to witness this conversation and to gather your insights. And I can tell by the audience questions that the audience is also finding that's resonating with them as well. So kicking it off with, I know you have answered some of the questions already that came through live, so we'll skip those ones and we'll move to some of the newer ones that came in. From Eric, we have, back to the rock analogy, is carbon insetting one of the core rocks? And who has to do the most pushing to encourage this as part of a broader regenerative agriculture practices? As in which players like banks, CPGs, things like that?
I mean, it's a good question about, like, are there certain players that are more important or less? I would say it's it's very context specific, but you kind of need all of them. Everybody's got a little piece of the puzzle, and you kind of need all of them. You need the off taker, you need the policymaker, you need the financier, you need the trader, you need the whoever has the relationship with the farmer, and single most importantly, you need the farmer. So if there's one most important player, it will be the farmer. But everyone else does have a important role to play, and that changes a little bit depending on the context. There's some places where it's much more of a cooperative, and therefore the cooperative is really needed, or the trader is very strong. But in the other places, it's a direct buying from the CPG, and therefore the trader is not that important. So there's some context specific things. I do agree with your point around carbon insetting is a pretty important outcome of this, that we have to. Carbon is one of the things. It's not the only thing we're optimizing on when we do food systems transformation. It is nature outcomes, it is farmer livelihoods, it is biodiversity, water, all of that, but it's also nutrition and hunger and all of those things. But carbon is a very important one. And insetting, in my mind, continues to be the more pragmatic, long-term, scalable way of transitioning supply chains versus creating offset. Not to say there's not space or room or need for offsetting, but it's really important that these supply chains change inherently, and therefore insetting is key.
Building on what Shalini was saying, and completely agreeing with the fact that there's an outcome stack that we need to be incentivizing and keeping in mind, and NRVing, so definitely beyond the carbon equivalent tons, at water quality, quantity, biodiversity, livelihood outcomes. When you start looking at where the benefits are flowing, you start seeing where maybe the value isn't coming back. So, for example, as Shalini was saying, definitely some water authorities are very interested in investing in such programs because it cuts their need for building a water filtration plant, which is magnitudes more financially in terms of the expense compared to the regenerative agriculture program financing. But Eric, to your point, actually one of my surprises from 2023 was that the momentum across the value chain and in parallel realities, for example, like policymakers, governments, nonprofits, as well as the financial insurance sector, the momentum across these pillars was not evenly distributed in 2023. I definitely was experiencing accelerated momentum, but some players closer to the consumer definitely feel a lot more invested and a lot more mature in their understanding of the space compared to maybe companies closer to the farmer or those players in the financial system. And we talked about a lot of the dollars coming from insurance and the government space, and those dollars are misaligned right now. So how much energy are we putting in versus how much energy is pulling the outcome in a different direction?
Yeah, agreed. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your perspective. It seems that the rock analogy has really resonated with many people here, because I know I had an aha moment when you shared that too. It just made so much sense. So it's great to see that that's coming through with the questions too.
Feel free to spread it around. Yeah. I was feeling rather silly talking about it all the time, but feel free to spread it around.
I think it's great because I think it gives people a visual to really think about the importance of collaboration. So that's awesome. So Olivia shared another question that she said, you stated earlier that practice change in regenerative agriculture needs to make economic sense for farmers. What novel financing mechanisms do you hope to see implemented in 2024?
Many. Oh my God, we have just had very little creativity in financing in agriculture. It's always like, we'll give them a loan or we'll give them a premium, and we might give them an insurance. And it's very uncreative, honestly. So there's a lot of innovation I'm hoping to see. Fundamentally, though, if I pull that all together, there's one thing I'm hoping to see, which is that financing players recognize that what farmers need is a stack. So we called it a financing stack in one of our publications, but effectively what we're trying to communicate is that a farmer cannot do the transition. They manage multiple crops. They have multiple assets that they're managing. They have CapEx changes they have to make. They have OpEx costs. You cannot go in with a single hammer and say, I got it and I can solve whatever mechanical problem you have because I got a hammer, right? They need a whole toolkit. And they need essentially the whole stack to come together. So financing players, insurance players, players that can take equity stakes, players that can do grant funding for certain things, players that can do loans at different levels of risk. We need financing players to start to talk to each other. And we need to start to cluster a stack of options for farmers rather than random things thrown at them here and there.
I will build on what Shalini is saying, and also look a little bit into the financial space to say that the classical business model for absolutely everyone involved in any industry, especially the hard-to-abate industry such as agriculture, has to change in order for us to keep enjoying the benefits that this planet gives us going forward in 2030 and beyond. Fundamentally, this means just like input providers to farmers are reinventing themselves, thinking about bio inputs, thinking about new models to support capacity building with farmers and its own knowledge of soil health and other ecosystem benefits. I would love to see the financing players look at their own value proposition to the farmer as to increase their socioeconomic resilience in the medium and long term, because those are generational businesses. Those are the conversations that are happening at the kitchen table. And it should not be the simple levers only, as Shalini said, oh, we'll give you a loan because we want you to grow your enterprise, or we'll give you something cheaper because you need to buy this equipment. There's a number of things that need to do that do not have to do with those two specific financial incentive directions that are coming up so often. Many of those alternatives is what Shalini mentioned.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point about incentives. I think, like, I know, Shalini, you talked a little bit earlier about financial incentives, nutrition incentives. The next question kind of builds on that. So I'd be curious to hear both of your takes on it. From Christy, she asked, how do you see the future of scaling up regen ag in relation with food justice? Consumer behavior can be shifted for those who have the privilege of choice, but how do these choices trickle into those who are less fortunate? I think that's a really interesting point to touch on.
Very important one. But Anastasia, I don't know if you wanted to go first or.
Yeah, I would love to. I would love to jump in and just briefly open because we don't have enough a lot of time, and hand it over to Shalini to share more. From the perspective of an impact minded person living on this planet, not necessarily as a consumer, looking at the need for all acres to be resilient is clear. We need resilience to be ubiquitous. Christy, to your question, can we afford some organic acres to be managed in a way that is perfect and resilient, and some other acres nearby to not be managed in a way that's compatible with the living beyond 2030? And can agriculture system as a whole continue to have the same level of impact as a quarter of the world's greenhouse gases? It cannot. So from my perspective, this is quickly becoming, this is not a secret to anyone who knows me, I'm Ukrainian. Ukraine exports a lot of its agricultural products to Africa. And Africa had to have a lot of subsistence in the last 2 years to, in a very drought-stricken conditions, in extremely yield gap obvious environments, have to grow more food because Ukraine, cannot produce as much anymore due to the fact that there's a large-scale war, and cannot ship all of its product. That is a food security issue, that whether we created this artificial case in a human way, or whether climate change will get us to a point where more harvests fail, and it's not the ships that will not leave the ports, but the harvest that will not yield what we expect. The food security, I believe, is one of the most significant issues that any government and any industry would look into. And we're in a precipice where that is very much a financial impact. So that is my angle to answer this question as to how this is not going to be. Basically, the TLDR is, I cannot imagine the world in which regenerative agriculture with the resilient outcomes is a premium. It cannot be.
It cannot. And I say that I think this is one of a bit of the false narrative that those with entrenched interests would like for people to believe, that it must be more expensive. It doesn't have to be. There are places where we have to invest as a society, and we may have to pay a premium, but that premium does not necessarily, is not everywhere. When these practices are done in places like India, the farmers were able to add one more crop to their cycle because the soils became healthier. There's examples in Africa, examples in Brazil, where the soils are so degraded. This can actually bring back a lot more land into fertility. So this narrative of regenerative practices, therefore, require us to pay a premium forever, is a little bit founded in falsehood. And when we did the study in Germany, we've done the study in Midwest, in the US, farmers' profitability goes up after the first bit of dip. So where we have to support the farmers is during a transition phase. After that, we have seen 60-70% increases in profitability because the amount of cost that they have for buying nitrogen-based fertilizers and other pesticides, et cetera, goes down because the soil is doing that work, right? So we need to disaggregate this dialogue. There's parts of it which will be expensive. We as a society have to figure out how to pay for that. Some of us who can afford it should, but we need to make sure that it doesn't affect food security. But large parts of it is actually better for us economically in the long run.
Awesome. What a great point to end our webinar today on. So thank you so much. I think that really inspires a lot of hope and optimism and the urgency to accelerate progress. Thank you both so much, and stay in touch. And we're really glad to have you both here.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Anastasia. That was really fun.
Thank you so much, everyone who's listening. And thank you, Shalini, for the conversation.